Greetings, CinemaBlend fans. I'm events editor Eric Eisenberg, and I'm very happy to be welcoming you to HeroBlend number 152. So if you've been paying attention this week, we have some fairly big DC news that came down the pipe, in that DC has finally found, after a long time of waiting, a brand new director for their upcoming Flash movie, aka Flashpoint. For those of you who have been kind of keeping up with the development of this project, this is a movie that when it was originally announced by Warner Brothers, I believe was supposed to come out 2 months from around today. So this was a film that was originally going to be one of their first big solo films. However, it has unfortunately faced a series of behind-the-scenes problems where first it hired Seth Grahame-Smith, who is the author behind Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter and Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. He was going to direct. Then he left the project. Then it was going to be the director of Dope, who I believe his name is Rick Fumiyama. I apologize in advance if I totally ruined that. He was on board. He did a huge Comic-Con panel, wound up leaving the project over creative differences. However, now the film finally seems to be ready to get started and moving forward, as Warner Brothers has apparently given the job to directors John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein. And to quickly kind of give you some background on them, they some of you may recognize John Francis Daley. He actually starred on the television show Freaks and Geeks back in 1999 as little Sam Weir, one of the lead characters of the show. In his adult career, has started becoming more focused on screenwriting. Kind of, along with Jonathan Goldstein, made their big breakout writing the script for Horrible Bosses. Went from that into the magician Steve Carell movie, The Incredible Burt Wonderstone, and made their directorial debut with Vacation a couple years ago, which unfortunately didn't get that great of a critical reception, and then more recently have directed the new movie Game Night, which stars Jason Bateman and Rachel McAdams, and is set to come out in a couple months. So these guys are fairly new to the directing game. Obviously, they are very, very comedy focused, so that should ultimately have an influence over this project's direction, something I'm sure that we're going to be diving into. But to kind of jump into your questions, Roberto Barajas asks, how much source material will they ignore this time? Fair question, if not just because the DC Extended Universe movies that we've seen to this point haven't necessarily been the most faithful things to the issues of DC Comics. A lot of people have different opinions on how kind of cataclysmic that is. Some people, I'm personally of the opinion that I like the movies to be slightly different than the comics, just because then I don't know exactly what's going to happen. Obviously, I think faithfulness to character and story and kind of idea and concept is important, but I'm okay with them not doing anything directly adapting-wise, and Flashpoint should certainly give them plenty of opportunities. For those who don't know, Flashpoint was an event that went down, I believe, back in 2010, where it actually led to a whole reboot of the DC universe known as the New 52. But essentially what the entire event was, Barry Allen, aka The Flash, went back in time, saved his mother from being murdered, which was a major cataclysmic event in his life that kind of changed everything for him, and apparently changed the world, because after Barry Allen saves his mom, comes back to the future, he realizes that his action has completely changed the entire world as we know it. So, for example, Aquaman and Wonder Woman are engaged in this gigantic war that has devastated Europe. Cyborg is kind of the hero on the level of Superman, as far as kind of this seen as the world's savior. Superman's actually trapped in a government lab. Bruce Wayne is dead. He was shot as a child in an alley after leaving a movie theater with his parents. His parents survived, and were both individually reacted to the guilt very differently. You had Thomas Wayne, who ended up becoming a vigilante and actually became Batman himself. And then you had Martha Wayne, who went completely insane after the death of her son and actually turned into the Joker. So it's a movie. Flashpoint as a story is a big crossover event that should feature just about everybody in the comics universe. We have heard kind of pieces of that ever since the project was officially announced at Comic-Con this past year. So as for fidelity to the source material, I would not be surprised if they do legitimately make Flashpoint the epic event movie that it should be. Mind you, it was done on the Flash without that kind of pomp and circumstance, but I think that the big screen, even if they do change certain elements, still has a certain amount of potential. Akash Shakavardi, apologies if, again, mispronunciation, but will it be a direct adaptation of Flashpoint, and will it be a comedy? Again, not sure about the direct adaptation. I think that there are certain elements that I think they would have to be kind of crazy to ignore. For example, the fact that you have Zack Snyder cast Jeffrey Dean Morgan as Thomas Wayne in Batman v Superman, and are you telling me that you wouldn't want to see Jeffrey Dean Morgan as Thomas Wayne as Batman, as this like really cruel, over the top, like dark Batman? I think that would be fairly neat. And actually, I had the chance to talk with Jeffrey Dean Morgan about it a couple years ago, and he's totally on board with the idea. So that is definitely something that I would love to see. But to the point about it being a comedy, that is the kind of big question of the moment, particularly with the hiring of John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein, because these are guys that don't have drama on their record on their resumes. As mentioned, their titles include Horrible Bosses, Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs 2, the Vacation reboot, and the upcoming comedy Game Night. So they are very much focused on the humor. Admittedly, they're also, in case you hadn't realized, a lot of those titles are Warner Brothers titles, so they are kind of part of that family. So that's probably helped them get the job a little bit. But whether or not Flashpoint should be a comedy is a question that people should be asking, because in case you hadn't realized by the description that I just gave of everything, Flashpoint isn't really a funny story. I'm sure that there are plenty of funny things that you could do within the narrative that would just be kind of like, oh, that's kind of neat and a funny idea. But overall, it is kind of meant to be a more dramatic kind of arc. It does speak to where what DC basically wants to do with Ezra Miller's version of the Flash introduced last year in the Justice League movie. Clearly, after Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad, Warner Brothers got a certain message from fans, whether real or interpreted, that their movies were too dark and too serious. So Ezra Miller's Flash was made to be very much the kind of source of comedy in Justice League, and it definitely does seem like that's kind of where they're pushing that character. So as we get into a solo Flash film, I do suspect that it will be funnier, just because that seems to be the characterization of Barry Allen that they're going with for this big screen world. However, it shouldn't be a straight comedy. It's just not a project that is made for that story. Connor Robbie says, is it possible to make a Flashpoint movie more serious, or are the screen and comic writers too dependent upon his comedy? This is, of course, the big whole thing, because, and it brings up an interesting question just about the characterization of Barry Allen, because there are some people, I don't think anybody walked away from Justice League and didn't laugh at least once at one of the funny lines that Ezra Miller's Barry Allen kind of threw out there. They definitely do seem a lot more committed to making him the comedic center point of the story. But it is weirdly kind of not necessarily in tone with everything that pop culture establishes about the character. I mean, you just have to look at the Grant Gustin version from the CW show, who deals with quite a bit of drama in his life. There is a certain comedic element that is inherent with super speed. I think that actually the X-Men movies have done a great job showing that off. Quicksilver, played by Evan Peters in X-Men Days of Future Past and X-Men Apocalypse, is fantastic because his brain is constantly moving a mile a minute. So like that's kind of how his thought process work, and it comes across as funny. So I definitely understand the impulse of making it of kind of upping the humorous part of Ezra Miller's character. However, there is a part of me that is concerned that they are going to kind of undercut the seriousness that is very important to the character, which involves obviously his father being in prison. Hell, even the entire setup for Flashpoint is dealing with a very dramatic setup, because the whole point of it is that Barry Allen can't find himself living in a world anymore where he has to deal with the weight of the death of his mother when he was a child. That's a seriously dramatic thing, and you have to make a choice when you're going to go back in time and reverse that kind of thing. That has to come from a certain amount of heart, and you can't just play that off as a joke. That doesn't really work, and that is going to be a big question that John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein will have to answer. Right now, it's important to note that these are guys that don't have a tremendous amount of experience behind the lens. Obviously, they have worked as screenwriters. They've now directed 2 different films, but blockbuster-wise, they've never done anything like it. It's kind of a trend that we are seeing a lot in Hollywood nowadays, where you are seeing studios kind of take these up-and-coming filmmakers and give them something. And to Hollywood's credit, it sometimes does work out tremendously. I mean, just look last year with Taika Waititi and Thor Ragnarok. That was a movie that was far bigger than anything that he had done before, and yet he completely nailed it out of the park. Unfortunately, the other side of that is sometimes you get Josh Trank directing Fantastic Four after directing Chronicle, and the whole thing winds up becoming a complete shit show. So, whether John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein, and actually, you know what? I haven't even mentioned this. I can't believe I have totally forgotten this. But they also worked on the Spider-Man script. They worked on the script for Spider-Man Homecoming. They were one of, it should be noted, many writers that developed that script. So you can't necessarily give them every single credit for how good that movie was. However, there is a certain amount of credit to be given. I'm sure that the folks at Warner Brothers, when they were thinking about Daley and Goldstein for the job of the Flash movie, that was something that they were keeping in heavy consideration. And but whether or not they are up for the task, we'll have to wait and see. Jason Bryan says, no matter what, it won't be as good as the animated version of Flashpoint. I have to admit that I actually have not seen the animated version of Flashpoint. I'm familiar with the comics, the version from the Flash television series, and obviously there's now this kind of big developing version. That being said, DC animated films have a long legacy of being incredible. I was a huge fan as a kid growing up. I grew up with the Batman the Animated Series and the Superman Animated Series and the Justice League Animated Series, and so I actually Paul Dini is a person that I would personally love to see kind of get a larger voice within the DC Extended Universe, just because I think those guys, him and his team, all have such an incredible handle. Bruce Timm as well, have an incredible handle on who these characters are and the importance that they have. So yeah, we'll see how that works out. Jesse Dillon asks a very simple question, which is ETA. Fairly simple question, but one that doesn't have a firm answer at this point. Just to kind of recap kind of what the DC universe is looking like right now. They had Justice League out in November of this past year in 2017. In December of this year, we will be seeing James Wan's Aquaman movie, which I'm personally super excited for it, just because I thought Aquaman was the standout of Justice League, and I think James Wan's an incredible director. So that movie definitely has my attention. Hopefully they are going to kind of start improving things, kind of looking at things a bit differently within the restructuring of behind the scenes at Warner Brothers that may perpetuate things in the forward. After that, you have David S. Sandberg's Shazam movie, which, again, that's actually another perfect example of Warner Brothers not only going to a guy that they've previously worked with because he made Annabelle Creation for them, but is another guy who is a filmmaker who doesn't have the kind of big blockbuster experience, and yet Warner Brothers feels that they can trust him with this big property. So clearly Warner Brothers is willing to take a chance on this. That movie is going to be a little bit funnier, which really is kind of, you almost think that David S. Sandberg, I'm just thinking out loud right now, but David S. Sandberg and Goldstein and Daley might be better off switching places just because of where those tones go. Then you have Wonder Woman 2, which I believe is also set or looking at a late 2019 date, which then leaves us to Flash. Flash, to bluntly answer your question, doesn't have a release date yet. Frankly, I don't even think that the deal with Daley and Goldstein is necessarily finalized yet. And Warner Brothers at this point should make a release date for Flash the absolute last thing that they should do, simply because the last thing that they want to do at this point is have more release date delays. If something happens with Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, like has happened with every single other director that they've approached for Flash, it's possible that won't necessarily, that the release date won't come together, and that the once again have to push it. That's just bad looking from a publicity standpoint. So it may be a minute before we actually hear when this movie's coming out. But if we are looking at kind of a range of dates, if John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein are being hired now, maybe they do 6 months of development. You have production that takes place during most of 2019, and therefore you can probably get a Flash movie done sometime released in the year 2020. I think that's fairly reasonable. Again, everything behind the scenes has to actually work out, and there's no guarantee that that's actually going to happen. But, we'll see. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I appreciate you guys. All you guys had amazing questions and kind of feedback for this week, and obviously this is a big development that we are going to be talking about for many months ahead, and on plenty of episodes, not on HeroBlend, and in many features on CinemaBlend. So for future episodes of HeroBlend, we are always here on Thursdays at 1 p.m. PST, 4 p.m. EST. We always love hearing from you, and we're always here to dissect the biggest news coming out about comic book movies and television shows. So please stay tuned till next time, and we'll see you then. Have a good one.